Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the Sierra Club Pennsylvania Chapter Conservation Webinar Series. The session today is titled Counting Climate Deaths, and hosted by the Pennsylvania Chapter's Climate Change Conservation Team. My name is Jim Wiley. I'm a volunteer. My role as a volunteer in the Sierra Club Pennsylvania Chapter is as the Conservation Vice Chair. Before I introduce today's speaker, and today's topic, let's do a little housekeeping. I've muted everyone to get started. Yes, I can do that now. Please keep your microphone muted until we are invited to come off mute. You're invited to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your county, or town in the chat. You can enter questions into the chat while during our presentation. We will have time for discussion at the end of the speaker's presentation. If a question seems like a clarifying question, like what does that acronym mean, I might interrupt the speaker if I see it in the chat. Please refrain from making any comments either verbally or in the chat about the upcoming election or candidates. Whether Sierra Club has endorsed them or not, this session will be recorded, and it will just make it harder for us to post the recording if it has political content. So today, our speakers, I'm Jim Wiley. I introduced myself. I'm the Chapter Conservation Vice Chair, and we're going to be hearing from Christina VandePol, who is a former Chester County coroner. She can give you a little more on her background in just a minute. I also wanted to put this in the context of the webinar series that we're having this fall. This is the second event that we've had, and we're going to have 7. And I'll go through each of those and the ones that are left after our presentation and Q&A. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to stop my share and invite Christina to start her presentation. Christina, you want to say a little more about yourself and get us going? Oh, Christina, you're muted. There, that one.
Okay, how's that?
Well, we can see all the slides. It's not in presentation mode. I think it's that easel down.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, and you can still hear me. Because the last time I did that, you've lost my voice. Okay, so what I was saying was thanks to Jim for inviting me to do this talk. And I just want to thank everyone who's signing on for being here to hear about death and disasters on a beautiful day when you could be out in the sunshine and maybe taking a walk and enjoying the beautiful fall weather. So I'm sure a lot of you wondered when you saw that the topic of this talk, what do death and coroners have to do with climate change? And I know that that was my first reaction too, and I really didn't understand the connection until my last year in office, which was 2021. So I'm a physician by background. I was the coroner from 2018 to 2021, and obviously my timing was really bad because COVID started in the middle of my term. But by 2021, as vaccinations were happening and we were emerging a bit from COVID, I suddenly became aware of all the climate disasters that were affecting my job and that of every other coroner and medical examiner in the United States. Okay, so in 2021, here is a brief summary of all the major climate disasters that impacted the entire United States, but each of them also impacted our area to some extent. The first thing was the winter weather. If you remember the polar vortex, that really Texas made most of the news on this because it was so unusual for them to have freezing weather, even in the winter. Then, and here in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is where I am, I certified at least 7 deaths due to hypothermia, which was a first in my time, and I don't know if that's ever happened again since. Then summer came along and we had some legendary heat waves, particularly up in the Northwest, which was totally unused to having anything like that. And we were not exempt here from a severe summer heat wave, which have only gotten worse since, but the first one that I remember distinctly was 2021. And then I headed out to Denver for a week to visit a friend who'd had an accident. And this was the time when the wildfires in California and Canada were blowing smoke across the United States, and Denver was so badly affected that I had to wear an N95 mask outside, and started thinking about the effect of smoke and particulate matter on people with lung disease. I returned home, and in September, we dealt with the remnants of Hurricane Ida, and sadly, I had to certify a death due to drowning directly due to the hurricane. So in 2021, I really became aware of this, and I've continued to follow this since. How does death certification happen for climate disasters? And where do we see this going in the future? And why does it matter? Well, obviously it matters for the reason that if we know more about what is affecting people during a disaster, we can help protect them in the future. But what I'm really focusing on today is the fact that, as this NPR quote says, we can also have policies being spurred that address global warming by knowing how it's affecting people. So it's headlines that spur policies, right? And what gets into the headlines with the disaster was basically 2 things. One is, what's the death toll? And the other is, what's the economic toll? And so I'm going to focus on the death toll today, how that's calculated, and or how it's not, in terms of undercounting being a big issue. Here are a few of those headlines. Starting at the bottom, we have 2021, the Northwest heat wave, where it was calculated that there were hundreds of extra deaths that occurred. Then in 2023, we had a huge wildfire in Maui, and the town of Lahaina was completely obliterated by that blaze. And I actually was invited to do this talk before Hurricane Helene. Again, my timing was either good or bad, depending on how you look at it. We're still not sure what the death toll is from that hurricane, and I'll show you why in a minute, why it takes so long to find that out. And the reason is that counting a death due to climate disaster or just a climate event is not easy. So think about what North Carolina went through recently. Everything was down. Buildings were obliterated, communications were gone, water, everything. Well, the people who do the forensic examinations, who decide what the cause and manner of death is, are equally affected. So forensic examination becomes as unreliable as anything else. The way a forensic investigation usually would proceed if we didn't have a disaster going on, is a report comes into a coroner or medical examiner office about a death. Someone goes to the scene, examines what's going on. Maybe an autopsy is done, maybe not. Maybe toxicology and other tests are done, maybe not. Eventually, there's an autopsy report, and everything along the way is documented electronically. And eventually, that death certificate is certified electronically, goes to the state, and then eventually goes to CDC, which is where the official US vital statistics numbers come from. But if the whole basis of that investigation is unreliable, obviously your data is unreliable. Another reason that counting climate deaths isn't easy is because there are two different ways to document deaths due to something like a hurricane or a heat wave. There's the direct cause of death, and then there's the indirect factor. So heat may be an indirect factor contributing to the death. It may not be the primary cause of death. But most sadly, a lot of people who do death certification don't bother with the second part, the indirect contributing factors to the cause of death. They just put some basic cause of death on the part one of the death certificate, the direct cause of death. So we're losing a lot of the information about indirect effects of climate on death count. And then finally, something that should be easy to do, but doesn't get done, is naming the disaster on the death certificate. And this is something that CDC is really interested in having coroners and medical examiners do, but it's not always easy because not every climate event, the disaster event, has a name. So hurricanes is fairly easy, and they're short-lived, discrete events, and you can say, okay, a tree fell down, someone's, was unfortunately killed from that, and the cause of death then was directly related to the hurricane. But as you'll see, I'm going to talk about heat-related deaths. It's not so easy to connect the dots there. Hurricane Maria is a great case study. This was back in 2017. And you may remember there was a lot of controversy about how the island was ignored. There wasn't enough support provided. The death counts were totally off and underestimated. So 3 months after the hurricane, which was in September, but in December, the official death toll at that point was only 64. And everybody was saying, that can't be right, that can't be right. By August of next year, so almost a year since the hurricane itself, there was an estimate of almost 3,000 people having died as a consequence of Hurricane Maria. And then in September of 2019, so now we're 2 years later, the number is estimated to be over 4,000. So both of these second numbers are estimates. They're statistical models. They're excess death counts, but they're not based on actual individual by individual death certification. And that's why the true number will never probably be known, but that September 2019 number is just an estimate, that 4,645. The actual number is somewhere in between 793 and over 8,000. That's the range that the statisticians gave that came up with that number. So we're never going to know, and the reason is because death certification due to natural disasters is not an easy thing to do. Then we had Hurricane Beryl in Texas. Hit Houston around end of the first week of July, right after the 4th of July. If you've ever been in Houston in the summer, you know it's pretty unbearable if you don't have air conditioning. So, but what's very interesting about Houston is that they have a really good forensic center there, a medical examiner system. And they not only do very good death investigations, but they publish and issue news with specific causes and manner of death for people that die in high-profile events. So these are actual causes of death certified by the medical examiner in Houston after Hurricane Beryl. The first one is somebody whose direct cause of death was environmental heat exposure. Why did this happen? Because they lost power. They lost their air conditioning. This certification also included specifically mentioning the name of the disaster that happened. Hurricane Beryl was right there on the death certificate. So it will be counted officially eventually once it gets to CDC as a Hurricane Beryl related event. That's not necessarily true of two other causes of death that were certified at the time. The primary cause of death in this next example was cardiovascular disease. So this was someone that already had heart disease. Then they lost electricity and air conditioning and were exposed to excessive heat, which is considered in this case a contributing factor to their death. It will still be counted as a heat-related death, but Hurricane Beryl won't necessarily be connected to this death certificate. Third example, someone with underlying pulmonary disease. This person's cause of death was complications of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and they lost their supplemental oxygen supply because of electricity loss. So a real lesson from Hurricane Beryl is the infrastructure destruction impacts the death toll. And obviously, there's a lot of problems with the resilience of the electrical grid in Texas. And they've seen that twice now with the polar vortex and then with this hurricane and other heat waves. So heat wave deaths are notoriously difficult to certify, and I say even more notoriously undercounted. You may or may not have read about that this year in particular. The way that a heat wave death is listed on a death certificate is it's called excessive exposure to environmental heat. I don't know how they came up with that long a term, but that's what usually gets put on the death certificate. And there are two types of heat-related deaths. So again, we're back to direct cause of death and indirect cause of death. A heat-caused death is one where the heat was directly the cause of death. A heat contributory death is where heat contributed to the death in someone who has another underlying disease to begin with. The biggest problem with certifying heat wave deaths is the variation in death investigation practices and procedures in the United States. So as you may or may not know, practically every county in our country has an independent death investigation system. And they do things according to their own subjective ways of doing things, their own procedures. There is no national procedure or policies as to how deaths are investigated. There are guidelines from CDC and from the National Institute of Justice, but they are just guidelines. And a good example of this, this is something I wrote about last summer when the heat waves were going on. I was just curious as to how various jurisdictions were certifying these deaths. And I focused on two different counties. One was Miami-Dade in Florida, and the other was Pima County, Arizona. And Pima County and Maricopa County, Arizona, you may not know, are known for being the gold standard in terms of investigating heat deaths. It's partly where they are in a very hot climate, but it's also partly because their medical examiners there have done a really good job of being standard bearers for death investigation in heat situations. So at the end of July, Pima County, Arizona had documented, meaning completed death certificates, completed their investigation of individual deaths They had come up with a count of 140 so far. They still had almost that many pending. So the actual number is by now going to be much higher. But when I was checking this in late July, it was 140. I couldn't find anything about Miami-Dade, which I had chosen as a comparator. So I called them up. I called up the medical examiner in Miami-Dade County, said, hey, how many heat-related deaths have you had so far this year? And I was really surprised when I was told it was 0. I said, well, why is that? And I got an answer with something to the effect of, we do a really good job of managing, heat here. I'm like, okay. But I was referred to a state website that indeed confirmed, Florida, by the way, has a state medical examiner system. So I was referred to their state website where, in fact, it did say they had 0 heat-related deaths as of that date. They had 3 the year before. Now, I just honestly find this hard to believe. Okay, so I have to assume that there is some element of subjectivity or difference in procedures in terms of how they investigate deaths going on here. And I think this is just one example. You could probably pick 2 other counties in the United States and find equal discrepancies, which means that our national statistics or our natural disaster statistics are really unreliable. And why is that? Who is counting the dead after a natural disaster? There are 3 groups of people who can issue death certificates in the United States. Group 1 is coroners, group 2 is medical examiners, and the third group is doctors. And I also include under 3, at least in some states, including Pennsylvania, nurse practitioners and physician assistants can also certify deaths, fill out the death certificate and sign it. Doctors, however, are only by law permitted to certify natural deaths, from disease. Coroners and medical examiners are the only people who can certify deaths that are accidental deaths, suicides, homicides, or undetermined, where we don't know what kind of a death it is. If doctors get, for example, an emergency room or after an operating room death, a death that is not natural, it is their responsibility to call the coroner or medical examiner of that county and report the death and turn over the death investigation and the certification to the coroner or medical examiner. In our country, over 1,200 counties have coroners as their medical legal death investigators. The rest of the country, it's medical examiner systems. And we can have a city medical examiner system, such as New York City or Los Angeles or Philadelphia. You can have a county medical examiner system. In our state, Delaware County went home charter rule in 1979 and switched to a medical examiner. Or you can have a state medical examiner system like New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware in terms of our immediate neighbors in Pennsylvania. So they have medical examiners. So you can see it's a patchwork system. And a question I'm asked often is, what's the difference between a coroner and medical examiner? Medical examiners are always physicians. They are usually pathologists, meaning that after medical school, they do several years of training in pathology. And they're almost always forensic pathologists, meaning on top of that, they do an additional year of training as forensic pathologists in a medical examiner office. Coroners, it's all over the place across the United States about who can be a coroner. In Pennsylvania, basically, as long as you're 18 and eligible to vote in your county, you can run for coroner. That doesn't mean that some coroners aren't physicians. Many are. In Pennsylvania right now, Montgomery County. Well, that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head right now. Obviously, I'm a physician. I ran for coroner, and so I was a physician coroner. Usually we're in the minority. There are many coroners who have other medical backgrounds. They might be nurses, they might have been EMTs. But I'd say just as many probably have criminal justice backgrounds or were in law enforcement before becoming coroners. And a great number also happen to be funeral directors, and some places that's not permitted. In Pennsylvania, it is permitted. So speaking of Pennsylvania, I think most everyone in the call is from Pennsylvania. I would assume, yeah. So in case you're not aware, you may be very well aware of this, but we have 67 counties, and 62 of those elect coroners. 2, that would be Northampton and Luzerne, appoint coroners, and 3 jurisdictions, that would be Philadelphia, Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, and then Delaware County, appoint medical examiners. Now, sometimes there's a push to move to a medical examiner system, and some states have done that. Right now, even though I think that would be a great idea personally, it would be very difficult because there's a shortage of forensic pathologists across the United States. And also, every type of elected position is more, I think, politically entrenched now, so it's going to be difficult to switch systems. So this is the system we have. A little bit more about coroner elections in Pennsylvania. So they are elected in off years. So last year, 2023, about half the counties elected coroners, and the other half will elect them next year. Unfortunately, like everything else, coroner elections are becoming increasingly partisan. They really weren't until the last few years. And I'm concerned about what influence this may have on death certification. I don't think we know, but I think it's something we need to keep an eye on. So what I would suggest for people watching this presentation is that it's kind of your responsibility to learn what your coroner or medical examiner's practices are with regards to certifying deaths due to natural disasters. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. Best is when people are running for election, is to find out what their policies and thoughts are on this issue. Another is something you may not know, and this isn't just for natural disaster deaths, but you can request a verification of death form from a coroner or medical examiner for anyone. And it will tell you exactly how the death certificate was certified. What was the cause of death? What was the manner of death for that person? It helps if you have a name and a date of death. But that is something that the public has access to. There is some question about access to other information, and that's been litigated a lot. I won't get into that. I would also suggest looking at annual reports and ongoing statistics on your coroner or medical examiner's website. Unfortunately, many jurisdictions, not just in Pennsylvania, don't always post annual reports or statistics. However, I think it's worth asking and certainly advocating for having that information available to the public. I'd like to point out a resource that you can look at to get more information, particularly about heat, which is becoming such a big issue. The CDC's Heat and Health Tracker, if you put in a particular zip code, it will tell you what the heat risk is of that jurisdiction, of that area. And it also has a very useful tool called a social vulnerability index. It tells you if that particular location, what its level of vulnerability is to heat and morbidity and mortality, which is a great public health tool for prevention. So my final thoughts I want to emphasize is that death investigation and certification really is a local, sometimes a state function, but even there, state medical examiner systems always have a local person. That's the initial person on the scene. So that means each of us has a great potential for influence on this system. And I think the other point is climate change catastrophes are only going to increase. And I think it's our job to aim for and demand that deaths due to such disasters be accurately documented. And finally, I'd like to recommend a couple of books. I'm sure, let's see, maybe I should stop sharing. Can everybody see this? I'm sure everybody's heard about this book, The Heat Will Kill You First by Jeff Goodell. Scary reading, but very good. And then one you're probably less likely to have heard of, it's called Surviving Our Catastrophes. It was written.
Christina, if you stop sharing, then your face will be bigger. We'll be able to see
Okay,
those books bigger.
I will do that. All right. Can you see it now?
Hold it
Better?
up a little high. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. It's called Surviving Our Catastrophes. It was actually written after the pandemic. It's not specifically related to just climate disasters, but I love this quote where he says, the politicization of the pandemic has had deadly consequences that we still have to reckon with. And I would say the same is true of natural disasters. If we start politicizing death counts, undercounting, overcounting, whatever, that it's also going to have deadly consequences. So I'll just end there. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I think I go back to sharing again. I have a lot more information, including a few specific posts about heat and cold related deaths on my website, and a lot more references and sources that I was able to put into this presentation. So welcome you to take a look at that if you're interested. Okay, I'll stop sharing there.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. That was great. And we will follow up. I'll share the Christina's presentation with everybody, the links that she has in their presentation, and the titles of those books as well. There are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll ask Bill and Lisa to speak to those in a second, but I want to jump in here to take priority and ask. So, Christina, you were Chester County Coroner for which years?
2018 through 2021.
18 to 20 through 21.
Yeah, think of it as the COVID years, like just how
Yeah.
I think of it. Yeah.
So does the coroner's office, does the coroner get involved with every death in the county? Like if somebody dies in a hospital or a nursing home, where I would think the death is pretty much explained. Does the coroner's office get involved there, or do they go right to the funeral home?
No, it's a good question. And no, the coroner does not get involved with or certify every death. Only deaths that are not natural, or, well, there's a whole list. There's like a list of 11 types of deaths that coroners get involved with in Pennsylvania. The reason we end up certifying a lot of natural deaths is because every death that occurs within 24 hours of coming to a medical facility, like an emergency room, has to be reported. Okay, and so we get obviously a lot of cardiovascular disease, strokes, things like that. What happens then is you check the medical records, you talk to the physician who's there, and you decide if there's anything about it that requires the coroner to be involved. If not, the coroner releases that particular death certification to the physician who is there. Same with hospice deaths, we should never be involved with those. Sometimes there ends up being a 911 call. And again, then it's a matter of checking and making sure that there's someone qualified and willing to certify the death as a natural death. But
Okay,
every
thanks.
death that's obviously homicides, but also suicides, accidental deaths, and undetermined. Let me just say a word about accidental deaths. So one of the duties of the coroner is to review all cremation permits. So in that way, we see a lot more deaths that we never actually investigate. What we're looking at when we look at those cremation permits is whether or not there was something that suggests the death wasn't natural. And that might be something like mention of a hip fracture or a fall or a certain type of a diagnosis like a subdural hematoma, a bleed on the brain. Those all indicate that there was some sort of accident that happened that might have caused that death. And that if that ends up being the case, then the death has to be referred to the coroner and the coroner has to certify that death. Does that
Okay.
answer the question?
Yeah. Thanks. Bill Saby, you want to come off mute and ask your question you put in the chat?
Hi, I was wondering if you'd seen the OSHA's proposed rules for heat injury and illness and whether you have any reaction yet.
You're talking about the requirement to provide certain accommodations to try and prevent heat-related deaths and illness, is that right?
You know, I haven't read it all yet. I think it's talking about a set of rules that they're proposing to help prevent heat injury and illness in
Right.
or in indoor work settings. So I don't know if it's just the death part or whether it's all care for.
Yeah, I don't know about indoors. I'm more familiar with the fact that there have been a number of farm worker deaths where there was controversy about lack of access to water, lack of access to rest time or shade, etc. And I don't know where that is right now. That in some ways, some of that is state dictated by state law rather than national. OSHA does have jurisdiction, not jurisdiction, but OSHA gets involved in any workplace related death, whether it's due to heat or anything else. The coroner or medical examiner would be too, and then they would work with OSHA. The employer is supposed to report any death, work-related death to OSHA. OSHA can't certify the death. That's why the coroner or medical examiner is involved as well. But yeah.
No, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Bill. Lisa, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. VandePol. This was really interesting. Really had no idea what a maze work certifying climate deaths is. So
Yeah.
you had mentioned about the CDC that they have certain guidelines. Is there any movement to standardize regulations for certifying climate deaths, either across the state of Pennsylvania or US? Because I really think that this is important. And I don't know about, I guess it's subjective how the coroner or the medical examiner, determines what's the primary, what's the secondary cause of death. And there seems to be a lot of room for error.
Well, there is, and it happens. But your question about standardization, CDC issued a wonderful guidebook, if I could walk over there and pick it up. I think around 2020, which is something like, called something like Guideline to Certifying Deaths Due to Natural Disasters. And for every type of natural disaster you can think of, they have a section with a whole series of questions and things that should be done and how to certify that kind of a death. I mean, it was a wonderful resource. I was thrilled to have it. I used it in 2021, but it's a guideline because coroners and medical examiners work and what they can and cannot do is dictated on a state by state level. So like I said, it's local or state. So while CDC can issue guidelines, and they even had trainings for this kind of thing, and they have lots of training about death certification, they can't dictate how these things are done. It would be great if we could have more national standardization, but we don't. The closest we can come is to having perhaps more medical examiner systems, because medical examiners are trained fairly uniformly. And there's the National Association of Medical Examiners that gets involved and has a lot of guidelines, but there's no obligation for anyone to follow those.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, Howard, you had your hand up. Did Lisa steal your question?
Lisa had my question. She
Okay.
had it, so it's done. It's answered.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
I'm just curious, how many of you know about anything about your coroner? Did you know you elected coroners? People used to say to me, I didn't know we elected coroners.
No.
So yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yes, I know who my coroner is, Dr. Darby from Montgomery County.
Oh yeah.
And in fact,
sure.
she had like an open house for the coroner's office, which I happen to live like really close to it. So I went to the open house, which was super interesting.
Well, you're lucky because Montgomery County has this beautiful new facility that I believe opened last year. So
yes.
Anybody in a medical examiner in Philadelphia, the medical examiner system? Nope, Pittsburgh. All right. Well, I'm happy.
I did have a question.
Oh, sure.
Is there any way or anybody looking into the effects of policy decisions on deaths? For example, there are certain places that have not allowed local municipalities to put in place rules for workers in regards to managing heat in terms of number of breaks, access to water, whatever. Is there any way to know like how many additional deaths these policies have caused?
No, that's the short answer is no. The modeling is what mathematicians, epidemiologists have come up with as a workaround for not having actual on-the-ground knowledge. The media is our friend here. I really appreciated so many times information that I would read in the news, and then, you know, which they got through whatever sources they had. But no, in general, in Pennsylvania, at least, we have very little transparency around death investigation.
So what I'm taking from this, Christina, tell me if I'm off base, but when we see news reports or any kind of numbers showing deaths due to either specific events or just rising temperatures and climate change, we should take those numbers with a grain of salt. And often, and even if the article includes an official number and an estimate, we might feel better about the estimate than the official count, right?
Yeah, I think that's true now. So right now, the statistical models are obviously dependent on past baselines. They're looking at excess deaths, how things have changed over time. Well, think about in 10 years, if today is our baseline, then you may or may not be able to use that model anymore. It may not be that accurate as it is now. So I think that's a good reason to emphasize accurate death certification at the local level.
Bill, you want to talk about what you just put in the chat? A lot.
Yeah, I'm not looking at the chat. If there's anything there I should respond to,
Bill, just
somebody
put a
tell me.
couple of pages
I
there.
just copied a piece of the proposed rule, and it says the first trigger is heat trigger is a heat index of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or a wet bulb temperature equal to the NOSHA recommended action limit. And then they require cool drinking water, break rest areas with cooling measures, indoor work area controls, acclimatization protocols, paid rest breaks, regular and effective two-way communication. And the next trigger is 90-degree Fahrenheit heat index with some additional requirements.
Yes, and those rules are also supposed to be followed by, say, coaches that are training sports teams in the summer, especially high school, college age. Unfortunately, I had to certify a death of a young athlete, and which was not a good thing. And there are increasingly complex ways to measure the heat index. So you referred to the wet bulb globe temperature, I think it's called, or maybe it's wet globe bulb temperature, which is a very more complicated way of measuring heat that takes into account humidity and also whether you're in the sun or the shade. So it takes a number of factors into account in terms of setting the standards of what should be happening at that point, what the risk is at that point. So yeah, it's a better way to measure risk and the fact that we should be taking some action to avoid becoming sick from the heat. Thank you.
Ellen's just joining us. We're pretty much wrapping up, Ellen.
Okay, sorry about that.
Oh,
But-
any questions, Ellen?
Got delayed. No, I'm gonna look at the recording and I apologize.
That's okay.
So late. I was gonna not join and then I thought, well, maybe there's something happening.
Good to see you. Yeah, so any other questions before I wrap up? Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I have a couple other slides to share and wrap up. As I said, this is the second in a series of 7 webinars that we're hosting this fall. Upcoming November 7th is somebody from the Sierra Club New Jersey chapter is going to tell us what's up with offshore wind in New Jersey. November 14th, we've got our zero waste presentation with 3 members of that team talking about what we mean by zero waste. Carol's going to talk about microplastics in our bodies. And then Corinne's going to talk about consumer awareness, how we can avoid plastics, being exposed to plastics if we're careful consumers. And then November 14th in the evening is air quality monitoring. Tom and Allison are going to talk about the Purple Air Monitor movement, etc. And November 21st, we're going to hear some stories from the Center for Coalfield Justice about fracking in Pennsylvania and the ongoing litigation between CNX and Pennsylvania. And then wrapping up on December 5th, the transportation team and Dennis Rowan are going to talk about electric vehicle myths. So there's the link at the bottom to sign up for the other webinars. Finally, you'll find this recording and others on the Sierra Club Pennsylvania chapter YouTube channel. And I said I'll be sending out the link to that recording to everybody that registered for this. But I understand that people need to watch things on their own schedules and on the recordings, but it would be hard just to have this presentation with nobody in the audience to interact with. So I appreciate you guys for showing up today. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
VandePol.
You're welcome. Thank you all for coming.